Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are here with the breaking news of the case of Aileen Wuornos, as this case comes to an end. She was born as Aileen Carol Pittman, but goes by multiple aliases such as Susan Lynn Blackovic, Sandra Kresh, Cammie Marshgreen, Lori Christine Grody. Officials have nicknamed her Damsel of Death, Florida Highway Killer, or the Highway Hooker. The subject is 5'4", 137 pounds, 46 years old, Caucasian female, average built, blonde hair with brown eyes, wearing t-shirts with unkempt hair and bony facial structure. She was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, and now resides in the Daytona Beach area, but often hitchhikes on highways in Central and North Florida. She was charged with the murder of 6 victims, but has been suspected of 7, as victim Peter Simon's body was never located. The victims appear to all be middle-aged, low to middle-class Caucasian males. These victims fell in the demise of Wuornos, as these men were promised sexual favors, but were then killed with a .22 caliber revolver and posed undressed post-mortem. Officials said the subject has a history of prior offenses, such as illegal possession of firearm, forgery, assault, robbery, auto theft, and prostitution. Some of the evidence that were linked to her include being seen with more inside victim Peter Simon's car, while her palm print on the interior, along with other possessions of other victims at pawn shops with Wuornos' fingerprints. During arrests and prior apprehensions, law enforcement described Wuornos as erratic, easily angered, with poor attitude. Wuornos received the death penalty by lethal injection on October 9, 2002 in Stark, Florida State Prison. Prior to the execution, she declined her final meal, but was given a cup of coffee. Her final words were, quote, "I just like to say, I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus on June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back," end quote. Today, I have invited Special Agent Kyle from the FBI and criminologist Dr. Becca from Azusa Pacific University. Special Agent Kyle, from my understanding, you were on the scene of arrest. Can you tell us a little bit about how Wuornos came under suspicion, the scene of arrest, and maybe even the suspect action, how she was caught?
Yeah, so the belongings of Richard Mallory were found at a pawn shop where Wuornos ended up leaving a fingerprint on a receipt. We were able to track that back to Port Orange, Florida, where Wuornos was, and we ended up finding her at a biker bar called The Last Resort. From there, a task force took over and started monitoring the contact between Wuornos and her girlfriend, Tyra Moore, just checking to see if they were making phone calls or anything like that. So the task force arrested Wuornos against bringing charges against one of her aliases. Originally, we didn't go straight for the murder charges because we didn't have enough evidence. So we brought the charges against one of her aliases. And then from there, a few days later, we were able to track Tyra Moore to Pennsylvania, where once she was in custody, she started giving us information about Wuornos. So Moore told us that she had a phone recording of a confession that Wuornos made where she admitted to one of the murders, and that was one of the biggest pieces that we needed to be able to then charge Wuornos for the murders.
I was notified that there was a lot of substantial evidence that connected the evidence to Wuornos. Can you tell us a little bit about some of that evidence that you found?
Yeah, so some of the main pieces of evidence that were used were those confessions that we had. So the phone recording confession, and once Wuornos was in custody, she again started to confess to the murders. She got the idea in her head that we were going to charge Moore with the murders as well, and to save her lover, she decided to confess and own up to all the killings. So that, in addition to some of the fingerprints, again, we had the fingerprint on the receipt, and there's also a bloody fingerprint lifted from one of the cars that was from one of the victims, and we were able to match those up as well. So we also had ballistics from each of the victims that matched the gun that Wuornos was held on her person. It was a .22 caliber pistol, and it ended up matching the gunshot wounds that were on the victims.
Thank you for the helpful information on the crime scene, Special Agent Kyle. Were there other police investigations seeking out this individual? And why was it difficult to catch them? Did they have other arrests? And if so, can you name some of those arrests?
Yeah, so it was really difficult to catch Wuornos because she was so on the move. Her method of killing was to pose as a prostituting hitchhiker. This was also her main source of income. It's what she did as a profession. So she would hop into random guys' cars, and wherever they were headed, that's where she would go, and that's where she ended up. So that was one of the main reasons it was difficult to catch her. There were some investigations into this individual. However, she went by several different aliases. So again, when we originally arrested her in the first place, we brought charges against one of those aliases. But for some of her prior offenses, she has a pretty lengthy rap sheet. Her very first arrest was at age 18 for a DUI, where she was also firing a firearm outside of the window. So some of her prior offenses include things like robbery, grand theft auto, assault, and prostitution.
Thank you, Special Agent Kyle, for the law enforcement perspective. Now, Dr. Becca, can you tell us about the patterns of the crimes, the victims, the crime scenes, weapons, and accomplices?
Yes, there are multiple patterns to be observed here. For starters, her victims were all older white males who hired her for sex work. Allegedly, they were expecting to get what they bought from her, and in the end, they would wind up with anywhere from 2 to 9 bullet wounds in their chest. The weapon Wuornos chose was a .22 caliber pistol. Each crime scene would take place at a hotel that Wuornos and her girlfriend, Tyra Moore, were staying at. Tyra would work as a maid, and Wuornos would work as a prostitute. They would both travel around the state of Florida, hopping from hotel to hotel, whether it be through hitchhiking or just trying to cover their tracks. It's not clear whether or not Moore participated in any of the murders that we know of. She went so far as to keep her girlfriend out of her case in any of the murders.
Can you tell us a little bit about the similarities and differences between them?
Yes, her crimes altogether were very messy. She was notorious for being sloppy, leaving behind fingerprints, DNA, never wearing a mask in any of her robberies, and she liked to make statements. It was as if she didn't really care if she was caught or imprisoned or arrested. Even though she would resist arrest, it was all about making a statement. Majority of her crimes took place in the state of Florida. However, she did commit crimes in Michigan as well as Colorado. She's most notorious in Florida, however, because that is where all the murders took place. She started off by having a DUI in Colorado all the way to becoming a serial killer in Florida.
So, with your criminology background, do you believe that this person planned the event? And if so, how?
With my knowledge on the subject, it seems as if her intent was through the motivation of hatred, perhaps even attention. Her need for power and control is what drove her to perform such criminal acts. And as for her lesser crimes, it was more of a means to get by. She could have killed the 7 men for their money, as she herself claimed that she meant to rob them and leave behind no witnesses, or it could have been in self-defense. She doesn't seem to have completely premeditated the murders of her clients in comparison to how other serial killers might stalk or date their prey. But it is possible that she sought to kill someone who fit the profile of who abused her from a young age. In other words, a middle-aged to elderly white male, which just so happened to be the demographic of her victims. It could be said that killing those men brought her a sense of catharsis. It could also be that she was acting in self-defense. Or it could be that her anger over the years finally reached a peak and she took it out on the men who sought out her business in the cover of the night.
Thank you, Dr. Becca, for providing the criminological perspective on Wuornos' crimes. Based on her current information we have, her mother is Diane Wuornos and her father is Leo Pittman. Her biological father was a diagnosed schizophrenic convicted of kidnapping and raping a 7-year-old girl, then committed suicide while serving prison. She was abandoned by her mother to the care of her grandfather, Laurie and Britta Wuornos, who adopted Aileen and her older brother Keith at a young age. Wuornos claims multiple accounts of sexual abuse from both her brother and her grandfather from an early age and was impregnated at the age of 14. Wuornos believed the child was her brother's and was sent to a home for unwed mothers and gave up her child for adoption. Her grandmother died in 1971 of liver failure and heavy drinking, and her grandfather, Laurie, insisted that the children be placed in foster care. Wuornos began hitchhiking and prostituting, with her crime spanning over 4 years. She was arrested in 1974 at the age of 18 for disorderly conduct, drunk driving, and firing a weapon from a vehicle. From this information, I believe the audience are curious to hear how Wuornos ended up with a career in serial killing. Experts, can you provide your personal perspectives on this case and bringing your expert backgrounds in both FBI criminal profiling and criminology research? Starting with you, Special Agent Kyle.
Yeah, from my perspective, I would categorize Wuornos as a hedonistic killer. Her motivations were largely anger and financial gain. She really had a deep hatred towards men and humanity, which was reflected in her choice of who to target. Mostly she murdered just older white men. And she really had a lot of experiences with abuse at the hands of men and family members from a very young age all the way throughout her adulthood even. And this mistreatment finally ended up becoming too much, and Wuornos began to push back. So financial gain as a motivator to her was clearly indicated by the commission of the robberies. Had she been motivated for sex or some other reason primarily, she would not likely have stripped them of all of their belongings. Also, we saw that she went to pawn shops afterwards to pawn the belongings off for cash, which is another big indicator of her motivation being for money. A theory that can help explain her behavior and turn toward criminal acts is the social process theory. And what this theory says is that criminal behavior is really a function of the socialization process in society. So an offender really turns to crime as a result of many different stressors, such as family problems, abuse, poor school performance, and legal entanglements, things like that. So really, Wuornos had a lot of these interactions throughout her life, so it's understandable and it makes sense how this theory would play a role. And even drug use is a factor too, which we saw in Wuornos. So given her experiences with parental abuse and neglect as a child, as well as the abuse she endured at the hands of men, it's reasonable to assume that these had a huge impact on her social functioning and this learned aggression. And with learned aggression, it doesn't necessarily manifest immediately. Oftentimes it can show up later in life after certain experiences. And for Wuornos, over time, after these many awful tragedies that really happened to her, her hatred and distrust towards men really kind of capped, and she ended up snapping and eventually committing her first murder, which then opened the door for her committing further murders.
Thank you, Special Agent Kyle. Dr. Becca, your perspective?
Yes, I agree that Wuornos was a hedonistic killer, killing for the thrill or for monetary gain. She definitely had some built-up anger from the abuse she endured as a young child and later as a young adult. I do believe that the social learning theory provides an example for her lifestyle, seeing as though she was sexually assaulted by family members from a young age, starting at 11, later 14 as we discovered. She observed criminal behavior and learned that as a way of living. She was prostituted at a young age and therefore continued to sex work for occupational reasons later in her life. This goes hand in hand with the self-fulfilling prophecy of becoming what she was forced into. She never had an opportunity to be anything else, never had an experience to live out any dreams or aspirations. And because of the environment around her, the way that she was molded by her environment, it also shaped her mindset into believing that she was no more than what she was accused of doing, aka sex work. Furthermore, she could also fall under pervasive emotional dysregulation, where she is in a negative environment full of negative stimuli, which does not enrich her emotional state or her mental well-being. And because of that stress that she endured from such an environment, that being her childhood, her school, or even the criminal justice system later on, she will act out violently and aggressively when things don't go the way that she intended or the way that society expects them to go for her.
So based off of the evidence and the facts of the case, what verdict, punishment, or treatment would you give to Wuornos?
So based on the case, I would still likely find Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder. There was clear intent in the case. She committed each of the murders with the goal of robbing her victims, who each received multiple gunshot wounds. And this was also a repeat occurrence. It wasn't a one-time crime and then she went clean. She ended up committing these robbery and murders, we believe, 7 times. So it was clear she knew what she was doing. Each of the victims' pockets were turned out and emptied, so she had a deliberate goal in mind. As far as punishment goes, based on the case and her history of prior offenses, I would aim for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. And I don't believe that Wuornos should have received the death penalty in the first place. She comes from an extensive background of interpersonal violence and abuse, not only at the hands of strangers, but even from family members, people who are close to her. So that, on top of the fact that she was actually examined by psychiatrists during the time of her trial, she was actually found to have borderline personality disorder as well as antisocial personality disorder and was deemed unfit to stand trial at the time. But regardless of all this, she ended up denying or not accepting any of the appeals that she could have taken. So she denied this help. So regardless of all of this, I do think she should have gotten a life sentence rather than the death penalty. And she ended up welcoming this death penalty in the end, I think, because she just grew tired of the mistreatment that she had been receiving her entire life. As far as a treatment plan for Wuornos, in prison, once she would have been serving her life sentence, she would have gone through extensive therapy and received counseling to help process through her traumatic past, and as well as reform these aggressive behaviors and negative thought patterns that she had. She also would have likely been given medication to help with her mental disorders. Borderline personality disorder in particularly can be quite difficult to live with. She would have experienced severe and intense fluctuations and instabilities in her emotion, mood, and impulsivity, which can be very difficult. So oftentimes people will experience periods of depression and like grandiosity and mania. They'll be on this intense high, and this is very taxing on the individual. I think that if Wuornos had received mental health care earlier in her life, then this entire string of murders may have been completely prevented.
Thank you, Special Agent Kyle. Dr. Becca, your perspective?
Yes. For her verdict, she did take the lives of at least 7 men and rob them of their possessions. Regardless of the intent, this was a criminal offense that occurred multiple times, as Kyle here has mentioned, and it should be regarded as first-degree murder. Perhaps 5 or 6 counts of first-degree murder would be more applicable, with a little cherry on top of the robbery charges. For punishment, while I do believe the death penalty is a bit too harsh in her case, she should be receiving life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is a chronic repeat offender who, on record, claims that she will never change. Her extensive criminal history bears witness to her statements, and there should be some solace given to the victims' families by no longer permitting Wuornos to be allowed in society. As for treatment, she should be required to go through extensive therapy and counseling for her past traumas, abuses, and behaviors. This could potentially help her mend the bond between her trust and the appreciation of humanity, which she lost along the way. I agree that if she received proper mental health care and maybe even proper fostering care as a child, she would have been a completely different person. It goes to show, too, that making friends and building community means a lot. While in prison, Wuornos made pen pal friends with a born-again Christian, Aileen, who wanted to help her. She even tried to make it onto her defense team, but she was legally inexperienced. Still, the two remained friends as they sent each other letters until Wuornos was put to death on October 9th, 2002, which, fun fact, was my 2nd birthday. Also, coming from a woman's perspective, it is difficult to gauge her honesty in her statements of acting out in self-defense. On one hand, she could have been, but on the other hand, her credibility wasn't viable due to her criminal record. That alone contributes to the statement she was trying to make, that her voice was not being heard and her story was not being told. And this doesn't excuse any of her crimes, but it does illuminate the humanity she had, even if she claimed that she hated it.
Thank you, Special Agent Kyle and Dr. Becca, for your expert insights today. Wuornos has become prominent in today's news, and recently titled by the FBI as the first true female serial killer, the second woman to be executed in the state of Florida, and the 10th woman to be executed in the nation. Stay tuned for our next breaking news. This is your host, Chi, on Cougar News.